Okay, so welcome back to part 2 of this workshop on Richard Wright's Native Son. Okay, so following on from the first half, we're now going to think about two kind of connected ideas here. So of white blindness and also white liberal guilt, which we find in the novel, particularly coming from the white family that Bigger works for. So we have a quote here from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is a novel from the 1950s, where the narrator, the Invisible Man, says, "It is sometimes advantageous to be unseen, although it is most often rather wearing on the nerves." And so what we get from this idea is an idea that due to the blindness of white people around him, it's actually safer for the Invisible Man to stay invisible sometimes. So it's sometimes advantageous to be unseen. I think we see a similar kind of idea with Bigger, particularly at the beginning of the novel when he's working for the Daltons. So he, will just say yes to the questions that he's being asked. He doesn't want to stand out. He just wants to kind of blend into the background because that seemed to be a kind of safer position. But you can see from the second half of this quotation, although it is most often rather wearing on the nerves, I mean, you see that wearing down of Bigger as well in Native Son. So he, says yes all the time, but that's clearly grating on him over time. So two questions for you to think about for the seminar. One is, what do the images of blindness represent in the novel? And the second one is, how is whiteness understood in the text? And I'll just give you a bit more of an understanding of these two terms here, white blindness and white liberal guilt. So the blindness of white people we can understand, particularly from the father, Dalton, who doesn't seem to realise how his businesses have impacted on the Black community. He's kind of blind to his own sense of kind of dominance. But the white liberal guilt idea we can see from the younger Dalton family, particularly the woman, and also the way in which the communist figures are kind of represented. So we have her asking a lot of quite silly questions of Bigger, not really understanding his position, but also kind of seemingly feeling quite guilty about his position in society. So there's a sense of kind of disconnect here of even white people that are seemingly kind of well-meaning can have quite a difficult impact on Bigger's kind of sense of self in the text. Okay, so next we're going to just talk briefly about religion. And I wanted to bring in Karl Marx here, who has written very persuasively about the role of religion within a kind of socio-political context. So in An Introduction to a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right from 1944, Karl Marx says, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the sentiment of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." So thinking about religion then as the soul of soulless conditions. So the conditions in which particularly poor people find themselves, whether that's during Marx's time, but also during Wright's time in kind of the slums of Chicago. So religion provides the only kind of solace to people who live in these awful conditions, and so therefore becomes a kind of opium. So it becomes a kind of drug, so that people have a sense in which they, can have a bit of escapism from the awfulness of their own lives. But the problem here with religion that I think Marx would see is that there's an issue here with religion which seems to say, well, even if you're struggling and suffering in this life, you'll be rewarded in heaven. So there isn't a sense in which religion is in any way kind of revolutionary, which is what Marx would want. In fact, it kind of reinstates and reinforces kind of social barriers that already exist. So it kind of says that you're in your position and you've just got to struggle through your life and not really try and change it, because you'll be rewarded in heaven. So that reward won't come now, you should wait for it. And that was one of the big problems that Marx saw with religion, is that it was kind of very conservative and traditional, and didn't ask people to question why they were living in these awful conditions. It just said that you should, you will be there and stay there. So a question might be then is, how is religion presented in the novel? And you can think about the characters who have a form of religion in the novel and what that kind of brings them, or how they understand their place in the world based on their religion. And then I wanted to touch on as well the kind of critical reception that Native Son had when it was first released. And it was a very controversial novel when it was first published in 1940. There was a lot of people who were very kind of demeaning of the novel, felt like it was way too extreme. I think it was even banned in some places. So, but James Baldwin, who we're going to look at next week, who's a slightly later writer in the 60s, he says on Richard Wright, he was black, he was young, he had come out of Mississippi and the Chicago slums, and he was a writer. He proved it could be done, and proved it to me, and gave me an arm against all the others who assured me it could not be done. Richard Wright had a tremendous effect on countless number of people whom he never met, multitudes whom he will now never meet. So, as you can see here, Richard Wright himself came out of Mississippi, was really kind of impoverished as a young black writer, and then moved to Chicago and lived in the slums. So he, the Bigger Thomas experience is quite similar to his own in many ways. The social conditions were the same. But what James Baldwin's saying is that he was able to become a writer despite these conditions. So he was able then to influence a lot of other black men kind of coming up at the same time. And this is from Ralph Ellison from 1941. So this is kind of responding to the novel quite soon after it had been published. So Ellison says, in Wright's Native Son, we have the first philosophical novel by an American Negro. This work possesses an artistry, penetration of thought, and sheer emotional power that places it into the front rank of American fiction. So there's a claim being made here that Native Son is the first philosophical novel by a Black American, and that it's, a preeminent novel anyway in American fiction and should be seen as a kind of canonical American text. He also says, there must be no stepping away from the artistic and social achievements of Native Son if the Negro writer is to create the consciousness of his oppressed nation. So this idea of consciousness raising, which is again another kind of political term, a way for Black people to understand themselves and their own social conditions. So that perhaps is one of the key ideas behind the novel, is to construct the kind of harsh reality of Black American life at this time, and not shy away from that, not try and present it in any sort of more couched or pleasant terms for the white audience. And this is quite interesting if we think about Native Son, which came out in 1940, and Hurston's The Rise of a Watching God, which came out in 1937. And we were talking last week a bit about the ways in which Hurston might have been writing to a slightly white audience, or at least keeping the right white audience in mind when she was writing, as opposed to perhaps Richard Wright, who is clearly just writing, and he sort of perhaps doesn't care about the way that he's being perceived by white America. So some of the kind of literary and philosophical influences on Richard Wright then, which we can see in the novel. So the first one is naturalism, which is a kind of literary movement that came out of 19th century France. And a bit like realism, it's all about kind of representing the world kind of as it exists, in as close as you can to real life. But the key difference between realism and naturalism is naturalism is very interested in the ways in which the social world and the cultural world kind of impinge upon the individual. So there's usually a kind of central protagonist in a naturalist novel, as there is here with Bigger Thomas, and that individual is in some ways fighting against the environment in which they exist and struggling against that environment. And what you see in naturalism is that usually that struggle ends in tragedy. So there's not many naturalist novels that have a happy ending. There's always a sense in which the social conditions and social forces around them eventually kind of overcome the individual, and they're not, even if they're very strong and very kind of strong-willed, they can't overcome their own position in society, and that's what you get in naturalist novels. So the second two kind of philosophical movements that we might be interested in then are existentialism and nihilism. Okay, so with existentialism, we might first want to think here about a quote by Nietzsche that you might be familiar with from the early 20th century, which is that God is dead. So if God is dead, what then happens to society left behind? If you've no longer got religion as a kind of foundational framework in which you can understand your life and the world around you, how do you then create meaning, or how do you feel that your life has a sense of meaning? And so this is what the existentialist philosophers were thinking through. They were thinking about how do you exist, particularly in the 20th century, without God, without religion as kind of those frameworks. You have to create your own sense of meaning then. And nihilism is kind of the opposite of that, because it says, well, if we don't have any meaning, we don't have God, then everything is almost meaningless. And so we don't have to worry about constructing meaning onto things. So they're kind of two almost oppositional ways of thinking about kind of individual morality in the early 20th century. And Marxism then is another really important framework for this novel. So as we've seen, Karl Marx was a significant figure whom Wright read very thoroughly. And as you know, Marx talks about a class-based system. So the bourgeoisie, who we could see here as being the Dalton family, and how they oppress the proletariat class or the working class. So Bigger Thomas having to work for them. And, you know, Marxism, I think, is really a good way of understanding kind of, as I talked about earlier, how race has been constructed and perpetuated, and racism, but also the ways in which labour and kind of class relations play out in the novel. So why is it that Bigger kind of feels this real internalized anger? Well, he's been oppressed not only racially but also as a working class man, and so he's, you know, there might be a sense in which he's trying to create his own sense of agency. And then finally, psychology we might want to think about here, particularly people like Freud. So there was a kind of, in the 20th century again, a deeper kind of analysis into why people had kind of violent tendencies, where those tendencies came from. The idea of repressed emotions might be important with Bigger. So what happens to an individual if they're forced to repress all of their anger, a lot of their emotions about the world? Eventually you might get a kind of outburst, which we see with Bigger as well. So any of these influences could be interesting to look at for an essay on this novel, I think. Okay, so again, coming back to Ralph Ellison, who has written quite extensively about Native Son, we might want to think about the question of political instrumentalism here. So to what extent is the novel being written as a kind of form of propaganda? So Ellison says, in Native Son, Wright began with the ideological proposition that what whites think of the Negro's reality is more important than what Negroes themselves know it to be. So again, coming back to that earlier quote that I mentioned in the beginning of the workshop, the Claudia Rankine quote. Hence, Bigger Thomas was presented as a near subhuman indictment of white oppression. He was designed to shock whites out of their apathy and end the circumstances out of which Wright insisted Bigger emerged. Here, environment is all. And interestingly enough, environment conceived solely in terms of the physical, the non-conscious. So, if Bigger was designed to shock whites out of their apathy, he's a kind of instrument then. Bigger himself becomes a kind of tool in which Wright can kind of base his political consciousness and understanding around. So Bigger has kind of a specific purpose here, which is to make white people realise just how bad kind of racial oppression is at this moment. So we could think a bit more about this quotation, but I think, you know, we might want to think about the relationship between kind of literature and imagination and kind of political and being a political instrument here with a kind of clear purpose. And then we're going to just turn finally to Richard Wright himself, and this is an essay he wrote called Blueprint for Negro Writing in 1937. And he says, generally speaking, Negro writing in the past has been confined to humble novels, poems, and plays, prim and decorous ambassadors who went a-begging to white America. They entered the court of American public opinion dressed in the knee pants of civility, curtsying to show that the Negro was not inferior, that he was human, and that he had a life comparable to that of other people. For the most part, these artistic ambassadors were received as though they were French poodles who do clever tricks. And we can maybe think here again about Hurston in the first paragraph. So to what extent is she trying to prove that the Negro was not inferior? Interesting question to think about. So he goes on to say, white America never offered these Negro writers any serious criticism. The mere fact that a Negro could write was astonishing, nor was there any deep concern on the part of white America with the role Negro writing should play in American culture. And the role it did play grew out of accident rather than intent or design. Either it crept through the kitchen in the form of jokes, or it was the fruits of the foul soil, which was the result of a liaison between inferiority complex Negro geniuses and burnt out white bohemians with money. So this is the kind of literary and cultural context. Okay, so apologies, my internet just cut out there. So these quotations are the kind of literary and cultural context in which Wright found himself and which he was really determined. Okay, so just to finish off then, how is Richard Wright working against this kind of a context? How is he challenging this idea that he's not interested in presenting the fact that the Negro was not inferior because he just knows that to be true. Instead, he's interested in exploring the conditions, the social conditions and environments that have kind of created this form of inequality within American society. So how can we think about what Wright is doing as opposed to perhaps what someone like Hurston is doing? Thank you.